the soul and the spirit. And I feel it's very clear, using this definition of the two terms, that the soul represents the entire structure of our being. So under this definition, even the physical body is part of the soul. But it's the least permanent part. And the life force energy that animates the physical body is represented by the spirit. A little bit about the structure of the Tree of Life. The kingdom sphere at the bottom of the tree represents the physical body. And then within the physical body, we have the bottom or lower triad, which is made up of three spheres. One we already mentioned, the foundation sphere, which is just above kingdom, and that's the sphere of the animal's soul, the instinctual needs that come out of the life force energy, particularly the basic need of survival, which includes the reproductive instinct. This is the sphere of patterns, all the habit patterns that make up the personality, and things that keep repeating, that we repeat automatically. It's also the sphere of the subconscious mind and what is called the unconscious. The individual unconscious, as well as the collective unconscious that Carl Jung has taught us about.
And all of that's still under foundation.
That's all part of foundation.
Okay.
Now each of these spheres, it's important to know, is a universe unto itself. Just as we know, particularly from recent scientific discoveries, that the physical universe is a very vast universe. It's huge. It's immense, perhaps infinite. Each of the spheres on the tree is a vast and infinite universe unto itself, populated by beings that reside there. Conscious beings, non-physical beings. And we can journey into these different spheres in our consciousness and in the time of when we're sleeping and so forth. Often our dreams, our memories of excursions out of the physical body into what are called the inner planes, where these different spheres are. So this bottom triad, it's called the personality astral triad. It consists of the foundation sphere, and then at the bottom of the pillar on the left is what is called the sphere of splendor. And that color is orange. And the sphere of splendor is the sphere of the intellect, of the reasoning mind, the ability to think logically. And this is the sphere where the separate self-consciousness arises.
Say that again.
This is the sphere in which the separate self-consciousness arises. It's where the ego reflects itself to itself as a separate self. And it's associated with our basic instinctual need for power and control. Now this sphere has an energy path connecting it to the foundation sphere. So energies from the foundation sphere, it's a two-way path. Energies from the foundation sphere can come into the sphere of the mind and generate thoughts coming from our instinctual nature. And energies from the splendor sphere, from the intellect, can go down that energy path into the foundation sphere and influence the patterns that are there, what's going on there. There's always an interaction going on between these different spheres. Also, the splendor sphere can be impacted by energies coming from the spheres above it in the next higher triad, which is called the spiritual moral triad. And the two spheres above it, the one straight above it on the middle of the left pillar is called the sphere of severity and justice.
Yes. So the first triad is called what?
The personality astral triad. Now, the central sphere where the cross has an energy path also going to splendor, and that's the sphere of Christ beauty, of the divine indwelling in the soul. And the color of that sphere is a bright yellow. So higher inspirations can come into the intellect from the spheres above it when the intellect is open to them. Now, coming back down to the lower triad of the astral personality triad, directly across from the sphere of splendor, the orange sphere, is the green sphere that is called victory.
Victory.
Victory, it's called the victory sphere. And I'll explain that in a moment. The victory sphere is green. It's basically the sphere of our emotions, our feelings. It's the sphere of imagination, and it's the sphere of our willpower. So you could see that these two spheres, splendor and victory, form a pair of opposites of thinking and feeling. And there's an energy path connecting them, so they influence each other. Our feelings go over and affect our thoughts, and our thoughts come back over and affect our feelings. Also, there's an energy path from the victory sphere going down to foundation, so there's a two-way path there. And, I forgot to mention, the victory sphere is the sphere of our desires. Desire and will are close akin. So the term victory is used is that whenever you get what you want, whenever a desire gets fulfilled, you have a sense of victory because you got something you wanted. And of course, when we don't get something we wanted, then we experience a sense of defeat. So the victory sphere is very important. It's the sphere that's at the top of the personality astral triad. Excuse me. So these four bottom spheres, kingdom, physical, foundation, which is instinctual, kind of the animal sphere, splendor, which is the mental sphere, and victory, which is the emotional sphere of imagination, will, and desire. Those four spheres make up what I call our human ground. They make up the false self, which is the sense of who we are as a human being, minus an awareness of who we are as a spiritual being. So these are the spheres of our human inheritance and of our human limitations, our human identity, and our human desires.
So the images that are placed on the pathways between the spheres,
Yes.
those out of the Tarot?
Yeah, that's what they are.
Okay.
And I'm hoping to do a review of those later. But I'll just tell you this much. At the top of the tree in the crown sphere, that's the beginning of the whirlings of the energy of creation. And that energy works its way all the way down the tree in a particular order. And the images represent the forms that the energy takes during each phase of its journey down the tree. Each one represents one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and one of the 22 major arcana symbols of the tarot deck. But it's all the same energy coming down the tree, but it changes its mode of expression as it moves from one of the spheres to the next. It's very important to remember that it's all the same energy changing its mode of expression. So, going up from victory into the central sphere on the tree, which is the tree of Christ beauty, is an energy path. And this is really the traveling up through the small tree in victory up into the small tree in Christ beauty. This is a major completion stage of the soul's spiritual journey. It's a great homecoming for the soul because it's the movement out of human ground into the soul's spiritual ground.
Can you repeat that, please?
The movement of our soul's individual consciousness out of the victory sphere in the top of the personality astral triad, which is its human ground, up into the central sphere, the sphere of the sun, which is spelled two ways, S-O-N, meaning Son of God, and S-U-N, meaning the illuminating sun of truth in the soul, that movement is a major completion stage of our soul's spiritual journey. And that's the light at the end of the tunnel that the departing soul goes into after physical death, into spiritual ground. That's a homecoming for the soul. And it's such a wonderful thing that's why these people who've reported the near-death experiences, they didn't want to come back to this physical world because they felt so much peace and happiness and fulfillment there. Initially, that's the bottom level of our spiritual ground. So it's a transition which shifts our sense of identity from primarily thinking of ourselves as a human being to primarily discovering that we are a spiritual being. And at that point, the soul, the consciousness, realizes that the personality is not our identity, but the spiritual center of us is our true identity. But the personality is simply an instrument that the soul needs for functioning in the material world. And rather than over-identifying with the intellect and the emotions and so forth, or the instincts and the desires, we understand now that the personality astral realm is not who we really are. That's the realm of the false self. It's who we thought we were, but it's not who we really are. This core identity is the identity of the divine indwelling in our true self. That is who we truly are. Okay, now I want to share something with you which will probably be new to you. It's not in my book on the Tree of Life, but it is a little bit in the book on the Bridge Across Troubled Water. And it has to do with 3 different types of consciousness that we experience. But are very, very important. Actually, I could say it has to do with 4 of them. And these are directly related to the spheres of the personality astral triad and the sphere of Christ beauty. Now, in the kingdom sphere of the physical body, of course, we have the conscious experience of incarnation and of what we get through our physical senses. So that's a mode of consciousness we have as an animal, as a physical animal, which we share with the other animals, and it's part of our inheritance from the animal soul of the foundation sphere. The foundation sphere is the sphere of subconsciousness, unconscious mind, and going back a long ways in human evolution, the sphere of an archaic consciousness when humanoids were immersed in nature and lived that way, say in the Stone Age, and the first religions developed, which were religions of animistic nature worship and shamanism, and oneness with nature, and certain types of sacrifices and rituals were done to try to enlist the aid of the elements to help further physical survival in terms of having a good hunt and a good harvest and friendly weather and so forth. And that was really the beginning of religion in the history of the human species. And of course, there was a multiplicity of gods and goddesses. And the religion of the Great Mother was very prominent, probably because it's women that give life, that give birth to babies. And so God was conceived of as a female Great Mother deity. And this was, kind of a semi-conscious state of tribal life and existence that went on for many thousands of years and had many different developments in it. Now, the energy, we're going in the reverse order of the spheres, the reverse order of the way they come down from the top of the tree, so that it's going from kingdom to foundation, and then it goes from foundation to splendor, the orange Sephira. So, when the consciousness goes from the foundation instinctual sphere into the mental sphere of intellect, there's a special kind of consciousness that develops, and it's called the separating consciousness. This is the consciousness that has the power to distinguish the self from what is not myself. And this is inherited really from the spheres above it. So it's the power of rational thought, the power of discrimination between all the different pairs of opposites, and coming from the severity sphere above it, which is the sphere of the origin of conscience. It's the power of discriminating the difference between good and evil. In the sphere of the foundation and the subconscious mind, there is no ability to distinguish between moral or ethical good or evil. It's just simply survival instinct. Whatever gives me what I want and helps me to survive is good, and whatever doesn't is bad, but it's not moral or ethical. So, the separating consciousness is something that the infant develops early in life. In the womb, the infant is immersed in the foundation sphere and in a sense of oneness with the mother, synergy with whatever's around it. But then, when the experience of something adverse occurs, in other words, an experience of negativity, pain, this is what triggers the beginning of the separating consciousness. Because when you feel something painful after you've been experiencing something pleasant, you want to separate yourself from the pain because you don't like it. So we first develop rudimentary separating consciousness very early in life, with our first experiences of pain, fear, frustration, anger, those sort of things. The separating consciousness is necessary for survival, but if we over-identify with it, then it becomes a handicap to our continuing ability to live in harmony with others and with our surroundings. So too much ego makes us feel isolated and apathetic or impersonal. So when a wounding occurs to the need for power and control, the happiness program that goes with that tries to compensate by wanting to dominate other people and situations later in life and feeling very separate from them so you don't care. So in other words, it's too much objectivity and not enough subjectivity. You follow me? So we need a certain amount of separating consciousness, but if there's too much of it, then we're spiritually retarded. It's a blunt way of putting it. So then, in reverse order of the spheres, the next movement is over to the victory sphere of feelings and emotions. Desires. This is the sphere of what I call the connecting consciousness. The connecting consciousness is more subjective. It contains the separating consciousness within itself, but in a more balanced way. So it includes the separating consciousness, but it goes beyond it through forming connection, which means relationship. And through this, we develop our capacity for empathy and caring and identification with others. So the connecting consciousness also helps us to connect to our environment and to nature, to other people, and we don't feel so alienated and isolated. So it tempers the separating consciousness. Also, on this sphere on the right-hand side, on this pillar, the sphere above it, which is opposite the severity justice sphere, is called the sphere of mercy. This is the sphere of the masters of compassion and forgiveness and love. It's the blue sphere on the Tree of Life. Its color is blue. And from the energy path connecting victory to mercy, the soul may receive the inspirations of divine spiritual idealism, higher idealism, and compassion and love for others. So that's like the highest expression of the connecting consciousness. And the desire to serve the spiritual growth and well-beings of others starts to emerge in the smaller tree of the sphere, inside the sphere of victory, at a certain point. Also, the sphere has a direct connection to the sphere of Christ beauty. So, this connection, if there's receptivity to it, through openness, through the gift of contemplation in the small tree of the victory sphere, this opens the soul to the higher energies of Christ within it. which are healing, transformative energies that inspire us and encourage us more to pursue our spiritual journey so that we can prepare for the transition into the spiritual moral triad. So this is the connecting consciousness sphere. Now the third type of consciousness is the actual consciousness of the sphere of Christ beauty within us. And this consciousness is called the integrating transformative consciousness.
Repeat that, Renee.
It's called the integrating transforming consciousness. So it's the power of Christ in the soul which works our transformation in all of the smaller trees of the kingdom sphere and the personality astral triad. All the spheres below it. So, as we evolve through the smaller trees, starting with the kingdom sphere, as we evolve up those smaller trees, when we hit the Christ sphere, in each of those trees, something of the fullness of the divine indwelling starts to manifest in that smaller tree. And as we go up, its manifestation increases. As we go up, in other words, in the smaller tree of the kingdom sphere into the smaller tree of the foundation sphere. When we hit Christ beauty in the smaller tree of the foundation sphere, there's a greater expression of that Christ beauty than there was in the kingdom sphere. Are you following me? And this is a pattern that goes all the way up the tree, repeats over and over again. And each time we move from one sphere to another, there's a passage through the tunnel of the invisible sphere of Doth the cloud, which is the space of our contemplative prayer in silence.
Wow.
Are you starting to take this in?
Yes.
I mean, if you can get the transmission of the energy, you will know it. You know, it'll click on an intuitive level in your consciousness, and it'll be easy to understand what I'm saying rather than trying to figure it all out with your intellect. And if you read my book, it'll be easier to understand the book. There is a lot more to be said about this, but this thing about the smaller trees and the passage through the invisible Sephira is a key to all the mysteries on the Tree of Life, and also internalizing it so that you realize the key is alive inside of you, and the tree is alive inside of you. All these spheres are inside of each of us, with all their colors blinking. It's like a Christmas tree that gives birth to the Christ in us by degrees, more and more. For example, in the kingdom sphere, when the consciousness evolves in the small tree up to the sphere of Christ beauty, this is the initial awakening of the individual soul to the fact that it is a spiritual being. It has a sense of connection through the connecting consciousness, a victory in that little tree, to its environment, to nature, and a connection to other people. And the way that Christ manifests in that first sphere is as the Prince of Peace. So there's a very strong desire in the souls when they reach the sphere of Christ's beauty in the smaller tree of the kingdom sphere to promote world peace, right relations among human beings, and also to safeguard the planet, to protect the planet from contamination and pollution, to allow the planet to have clean air, clean water, clean food. So, as you know, there are many people who are on fire to promote peace and right human relations and to protect the planet. And it's the energy of Christ's beauty in them, in the small tree of this sphere, which inspires them to work for this. They find fulfillment and satisfaction through pursuing this goal of creating peace among all peoples and understanding in our world and protecting the planet. People who reach this sphere can be of a lot of help to those around them because their energy emanates to others. But also, under the idealism in the small tree of the mercy sphere, coming into the victory sphere, they may seem too idealistic to others who haven't yet awakened to Christ's beauty in that sphere. They may seem unpractical or unrealistic and be misunderstood by others. And this is because others have not yet come into the consciousness of Christ's beauty in the kingdom sphere. They're still primarily in the personality astral triad in terms of their consciousness development. But people who reach this level just about always leave a positive mark on the world when they leave this world. And basically, when we leave this world, our soul and the personality astral triad is absorbed up into the central sphere of Christ's beauty as a learning experience and as a memory. Moving up to the next sphere, the foundation sphere. This is where Christ's beauty in the little tree manifests as Christ the Redeemer.
Where are we? Which sector?
Moving up from the kingdom sphere up to foundation. See, I'm going to follow the same order I already did. Christ's beauty manifests in that little tree as Christ the Redeemer. And this is because in this sphere of patterns, Christ the Redeemer works in the soul to eliminate all self-destructive patterns of thought and feeling and action. All the patterns of the false self are gradually eliminated through the divine action, and they're replaced with new patterns that reflect the values and the motivation of the true self. So this is extremely important in the inner work of centering prayer, when we're consenting. You'll notice on the tree, there's an energy path on the vertical middle pillar that goes directly from the Christ sphere with the cross down the tree straight into the foundation sphere. When we are doing our centering prayer and we're resting in quiet, and there's peace in the spheres of the personality astral triad, and we're consenting to the divine presence in action, that's when the divine spirit of Christ the Redeemer descends into the lower world and starts doing work in the foundation spheres of all the little trees in this personality astral triad, in order to heal the wounds and change the patterns and start to build the new patterns of the true self. So the healing and the purification and the transformation is done in secret. This is what happens in secret when we're praying in our inner room. This goes on in secret from us when we're doing the prayer. But it doesn't happen all at once. It happens very gradually by degrees, according to the true depth of our consent to God's presence and action in us, and our trust and faith in the process. So that's why Christ is referred to as the Redeemer, manifesting in the foundation sphere. Because the foundation sphere in all these little trees of the personality astral triad, that's the bedrock of the false self system, which is in the unconscious, that needs to be transformed. And we have a foundation sphere in the little tree of our kingdom sphere, of our foundation sphere, of our splendor sphere, and of our victory sphere. So all of those need to be worked upon by the divine action in our soul. And we grow through one tree, little tree at a time. And then each time we do this, we have to go through one of the passages of the invisible sphere. The passages of the invisible sphere are what John of the Cross referred to as the nights of sense and spirit, the dark nights of the soul. So there's an actual psychological death and rebirth process and experience that we undergo during each of these transitions when we pass through the dark invisible sphere through our practice of contemplative prayer. Now, each time this journey is undertaken, there's a crisis of faith and a crisis of trust and a crisis of love that we experience. And the reason for that is because the higher energies of the next sphere we're moving into start to come down into that tunnel and they start to disrupt the stability that the ego had in the previous sphere, the stability of its habits and its sense of security and so forth, gets disrupted because a new pattern has to be created on a higher level of evolution in the next sphere. So if you stay in the stability of that previous ego state, then you'll be stuck there. So the divine action has to dismantle the structure in each of those lower spheres in order to bring us into new birth in the next higher sphere. And this is experienced as a crisis because the previous foundation that you relied upon is crumbling. That's why it requires trust and faith in the process of the unloading of the unconscious and the dismantling of some of our false self as we go through this. And we go through it several times. We couldn't tolerate going through it all at once. It would be way too much for us. So we just go through it gradually in degrees. But ultimately it's going to take us all the way out of the personality astral triad and rebirth us into the spiritual moral triad. But that takes time. I discuss this in much more detail in my book than I can do now. So, Christ the Redeemer manifests in the foundation sphere of all the smaller trees in this triad. This is how Christ redeems us, mostly in secret, but we experience some of the byproducts of that through the unloading of the unconscious. Now the passage through the tunnel of the invisible sphere, you can experience that either in a lights on or a lights off mode. Do you know what I mean by lights on and a lights off mode? The lights off mode, it's more gentle. That's when you don't know what's happening at all. It's sort of like you've been given an anesthesia and you're asleep and the surgery's going on and you're not there. Yes?
This can happen throughout the day
Yes.
without being in a physical room. It just happens in our inner room.
Yeah, the inner room is inside you. It's not necessarily a physical room. It's the inner space within your soul where it happens. And a lot of time, events in your outer life trigger and stimulate things that promote the dismantling and the unloading process to happen. God seems to arrange things that way to frustrate our happiness programs and so forth. It facilitates this. And so when that's going on, in order to be able to continue to consent and say, okay, Lord, I accept this, that this is your work in me, requires a deeper measure of trust in the divine relationship from our side of that relationship. The false self does not tend to trust God. It only trusts itself. So that's why there's resistance. And as long as we resist, we remain stuck. But because God loves us so much and wants to give us our divine inheritance, which is our inheritance as a son or daughter of God, God is going to keep working on us. But always it requires our free will, consent and cooperation and trust in the process. So going through Doth can be a dry period where you feel, like in the united sense that God has abandoned you, or it can be a very dramatic and consciously difficult and trying period. But in both cases, the same thing is going on in the deeper part of the soul, in the unconscious. This is really the heart of what goes on in the inner room in secret, which we don't see.
Again, how do you spell dark?
It's capital D, little a, T, H, slash,
No, don't do that.
well, the other word is the cloud. The cloud, meaning entering into the cloud of unknowing, entering into a state of uncertainty.
Okay, one, please. I've got to. My mind is just going every which way.
Well, just take in the energy, take notes, don't try to figure it out, and later you'll be able to sort it out.
We're going to have a chance. We'll have a chance to sort, because that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I think we need to see the
So when the movement through the little tree and foundation is completed, and one journeys through the cloud, the invisible sphere there, the next transition is into the little tree in the sphere of intellect, the splendor sphere, the orange sphere. There, Christ in that little tree manifests as the Son of Truth, S-U-N, the Son of Truth. So this is the sphere where old ruts of thought are removed by the divine action. False beliefs, misconceptions, and new ideas take root and form, which support our spiritual growth and free the mind from prejudices and limitations. So the work in the foundation of the little tree in splendor has to do with working on our habitual mental patterns, particularly those of the false self and too much separating consciousness. So a new clarity develops. How much?
8.
So a new clarity develops in the mind. And this truth is very illuminating, and inspiration from the higher spheres of the spiritual moral triad can be received, and this creates more enthusiasm, energy, and fresh ideas, so that the mind gets out of habitual ruts. The intellect is impregnated by the spiritual intuition from the higher spheres of the spiritual moral triad, and then it works on those ideas. So it's a real journey of mental discovery. Excuse me. Moving over from the splendor sphere to the victory sphere of desires and emotions, imagination and will. This is a sphere of great liberation, because here the emotions, particularly the afflictive emotions connected to the false self's programs for happiness, which are basically desires, all of that gets converted. Here, Christ manifests as Christ, the Messiah, and the Savior. And it's sort of like a higher octave of Christ the Redeemer. The divine action goes into the sphere of victory in the small tree, of the big sphere of victory, and changes the patterns of our emotional habits, the desires of the false self system. And this is where the need of affection, esteem, approval, the emotional need is. Heals that, and then brings in new desires for spiritual growth. And the individual becomes able to transmit spiritual energies of peace and love to others in a way that the other people can actually feel it, because it activates those energies within the small trees in the other people. And even if the person is not functioning in a public capacity as a teacher, just through their contemplative prayer and their presence, they feed energy to those around them on a subtle spiritual level, through the silence, through their own being, that stimulates spirituality in those in their environment. So this enables us to help serve God's plan for His creation's perfection and evolution in new ways, simply by the radiations of our presence that the Spirit does through us, through Christ within us. And it changes our outlook on life. And it begins the process of the identity shift from false self to true self, or from human ground into spiritual ground. And it prepares us to make the transition into the next stage, which is the graduation from human ground into spiritual ground. In other words, it's from the victory sphere at the top of the personality astral triad into the Christ beauty sphere, which is at the bottom of the spiritual moral triad. So this might be a good point to break it off. And when we come back, we'll start talking about this transition into the spiritual moral triad and a few other things.